Today you're going to learn what's happening next and why in World of Warcraft. And that's because the future of this whole World Soul saga thing is fairly clear. Soon we're going to go to Undermine, and then it's going to be patch 11.1.5 Nightfall, which very much tips us into the Void arc of this expansion trio that is what will dominate the Midnight expansion. But before that, something's missing. We're going to have a full major patch before midnight, the final patch of the War Within, 11.2. But that's where it gets weird. There are two story arcs that are barreling towards the conclusion of this expansion. One of them is Orwena and our World Soul, potentially meeting the World Soul. On the other hand, though, we've got the Ethereals that may be introducing Midnight's core threat, Demencius. Two huge storylines, two zones, ones that are being developed right now and in Undermine, but seemingly only room for one major patch. Take a look at this. It's allegedly a production map of Khaz Algar, and if you look closely, you'll see the block counts for zone dimensions with an entry for somewhere that is called the Rootlands. And if this map holds up, then, well, we could actually be looking at the Haranir's homeland and a future patch zone for World of Warcraft, which would make sense. As recently as patch 11.0.7, Orwena's companions abandoned her to return to somewhere called the Cradle. And if you're wondering where the Cradle is, we've got a fairly good idea. Check this out. Whenever you fly between Hallowfall and Azj-Kahet, we find these routes. If you fly into the routes, you're just transported to the bottom of the zone with the same drowsy effect that you see whenever you go out of bounds in patch 10.2's Emerald Dream. Of course, if you then connect that back to all the nature magic that Orwena has been using, it seems pretty clear to me anyway that that is in fact the entrance to her homeland. And that, plus a few other things, are the mountain of evidence that points towards a Haranir zone. Now that's only one of two contenders for our final patch. Let's take a look at the other one. It's called Koresh, or whatever is left of it. Koresh, by the way, is the ethereal homeworld. We'll do more of it later. Unused tooltips have got a tag that says Ethereal Raid, so those had been discovered in the game files, which feels a little notable because Goblin Raid files were also found, and look where we're going now. We're going to a Goblin zone. So, is there going to be a Ethereal Raid in our future? Well, that's at least one shred of data mining evidence that does suggest yes. And if there is to be a raid, would it be in an ethereal zone? I mean, the answer there is not necessarily, but take a look at all of these new ethereal models. These feature pretty heavily in patch 11.1, where we find a new faction of Void Ethereals who don't work for Xal'atath, which is quite the lore conundrum. It's probably the same group, I would say anyway, that have been following us since the Trial of Style in the Brawlers Guild, and we'll do a video on that soon. But the point is, their World Soul arc, that of the Ethereals, is just beginning. And so while the Rootlands do look like the most obvious option, Koresh is certainly possible. The evidence is circumstantial, nothing is solid, but firmly, it is in the good enough category. Which actually leaves us with a bit of a problem. Both of these zones align perfectly with where the War Within and the World Soul saga are going. We've got two major storylines to resolve, two potential zones, but only one patch to do it in. Let's examine both in proper detail. Okay, so the World Soul is the beating heart of this expansion, and it really is the core of this saga of expansions, hence the name. Now, this expansion began by the World Soul calling to us, drawing us to Silithus, and then telling us exactly where Khaz Algar was. When we get to Khaz Algar, the deeper and deeper we go, the more we discover that Azeroth is this massive force at the heart of the planet. We learn that the Titans tried to contain her, but that all of that energy just kept leaking out. It even turned some of the Titan Force servants into Thragar. Those Thragar then immediately tried to bust Azeroth out of her Titan-made prison, which was called the World Core. So, that's kind of relevant to the story. And when we look at Dornogal, freedom is a major story arc. The Earthen discover that they've got darker, hidden parts to their past. They learn of their ancestors rebelling and basically gain a new perspective on everything that they thought they knew. Then, when we travel deeper, we find Orwena. Her people literally worship the World Soul. I mean, here she is in front of the World Soul. If you remember Magni speaking to the World Soul, right, in the BFA expansion, well, Orwena is essentially the next level of contact there. Her story basically shows us what we're fighting to defend. It helps to make the whole World Soul thing make sense, and it will have to make sense because it's what the whole trio of expansions centers on. Now, we've also got a solid idea of what their home looks like. here's the story in that. Just after the old gods were locked up, Elune and the Titan Aeonar planted a world tree named Eluna here. Now, it did a stellar job of healing the void corruption that was around the place, maybe in the world soul, but Aman'Thul, the leader of the Titans, was not a fan of cooperating with a goddess of life, so he ripped the tree out. Again, think about, say, roots cracking a pavement. It just didn't fit what Aman'Thul wanted. But here's the thing for Aman'Thul. He ripped out the tree, but roots were still left below. Those roots had sank down to the world soul itself. They couldn't be ripped out. So then Elune sent guardians to tend to those roots. Those guardians are the Haranir, and the roots are their home. You then take a look at that data mining that says Rootlands, and the whole thing sure does seem pretty damn suspicious. And we can imagine what visiting it would be like, right? A small section of some vast ecosystem spiraling down to the core of the planet. And of course, if Aman'Thul's minions were ever to get wind of the roots, that would mean war. I mean, just check out the Kobold stories about the stone men clearing out their dens because they didn't conform to order. And the point of that story is that the Earthen mindlessly followed the Titans' edicts. They actually would be the sorts of people that you would hide from. They're exactly the people that the Haranir hid from. And the Haranir, they're a serious bunch. Their traditions go hard. Even in the face of all the black blood, crazy corruption stuff, Hanan and the others left Orwena to her quest. That's because their isolationism is so strong that fraternizing with us outsiders actually seems worse than confronting whatever the hell the black blood is doing. And if there is a plot line to focus on, it sure as hell is the blood. The Black Blood is a strange thing. It's defined this expansion, but without us really noticing or dealing with it properly. If you go to the bottom of Azj-Kahet, you find all of these ecologies of just stuff that's been twisted and turned, and the Black Blood looks like it's what remained of old gods. We find the Nerubians have been collecting it, and then in the campaign finale, Xal'atath says the whole point, right? The whole point of bringing us to Khaz Algar was to emotion dump our anger against her into the Black Blood. Which does make sense. That's exactly what happened with the remnant of Yasharaj, right? That fed in our negativity in the Mists of Pandaria expansion. Now, after powering up the blood, it's of course time to harvest. And that's what brings us to patch 11.1, where we find out that goblins are harvesting that blood on an industrial scale, all in a plan to repair the Darkheart after it was cracked by Illyria at the end of the campaign. So, what we have is this. Azeroth called Orwena to Khaz Algar to investigate the Black Blood. At every step, she has been there to bust up harvest operations and to peel back the next layer of the mystery. The Black Blood is an ecological and narrative time bomb to be resolved in this expansion, and its ultimate stakes are in a Rootland zone, as fits that data mining. So we can imagine part of the zone being serene and gorgeous, but the rest of it being twisted into some sort of purple horror. Perhaps with the Haranir Elders powerless to hold it back until we turn up. Is the Black Blood, is this enough material for the War Within's final patch? Especially when we consider that the end of this expansion is what catapults us into the thick of the World Soul saga. And of course I say that because Chris Metzen came back whenever the War Within was significantly into production. The whole World Soul saga thing only really happened after that point, which means that the War Within has been bent towards the World Soul Saga arc, but the expansions that are 100% made with it in mind are Midnight and The Last Titan. So if there ever was a time to go hard to launch us into those expansions, it would be the final patch. And if I was doing this video 1 month ago, I would have hard called Rootlands as patch 11.2. But then the content of Undermine actually changed my mind, and now I'm not sure. If you remember back to the prologue of this expansion, Locust Walker warned us that his own planet, Karesh, sang a radiant song shortly before Dimensius manifested and consumed the planet. This was, of course, a message directed straight at us, the players, telling us that Dimensius was coming, that there's a place called Karesh, which, I mean, we already knew about, but this was Blizzard kind of relitigating it and making it relevant again in the modern lore. And with Locust Walker's dialogue, they went so far as to directly tie Xal'atath into the whole thing, because it's clear that those two characters have got history. Why would Blizzard do any of that with Karesh unless they were actually planning to do something with it. And right now the assumption is that Xal'atath is working towards the same thing that happened to Koresh, but to us and our planet. And that work that she's doing continues in patch 11.1 and with patch 11.1.5, which is called Nightfall. Again, Nightfall, the thing that happens before midnight. Midnight, the next expansion. But here's where it gets interesting. Very light spoilers here, but I think it's worth bringing them up. In patch 11.1, we find void-aligned ethereals, but who are working against Xal'atath, which is pretty neat. During the Burning Crusade, the Ethereum ethereals basically sought to use the Void against Void, and we know that basically that completely failed, and at least some of them later formed the Shadow Guard. The Shadow Guard are the Void ethereals that we have seen directly help Xal'atath, so she is working with them. So it seems then that we've got another group of void-wielding ethereals who are opposing Xal'atath, which maybe suggests that they're some of that original group from the Burning Crusade who were our once enemies, yes, but still want to use the Void to fight the Void, which would mean that they're gunning for their ancestral enemy, the guy who basically destroyed their planet, Dimensius. And Dimensius has been foreshadowed as a threat for the Midnight expansion. And of course, taking out Dimensius would completely align with the interests of Illyria's mentor, Locust Walker, who again is a being that we know knows Xal'atath, wields the Void, helps us, and is the guy who name-dropped the planet of Koresh, which, is kind of what we call foreshadowing. And Koresh, as a patch, would be much like Argus that we had in the Legion expansion, the ruins of a fallen world. So if Blizzard wants patch 11.2 to impress, to get people back before midnight, this absolutely would be the play. Let's draw this into something concrete. Scenario 1, we get minor patches handling all the Black Blood and Rootland stuff, and patch 11.2 is Koresh. Scenario 2, I'd say that would be 11.2 is the Rootlands. We would get minor patches as we would expect, where the ethereals remain in the background and the lore slowly builds up, with Koresh perhaps being patch 12.1. Maybe that's what fully injects the cosmic void into the Midnight expansion, setting the stakes for the final patch of Midnight. But either way, to be honest with you, it sounds pretty good. If we get either of these zones, I'll be happy. And if you would like more ethereals, watch this next.